The countdown is on in Europe. This is Bloomberg Markets European Close with Guy Johnson and Alex Steele.
All right, from New York, I'm Alex Steele with my co-host today, Francine Lockwhite. Guy Johnson is off. Let's get to that breaking news. The Pentagon now confirming that there was a second blast in Kabul, in Afghanistan, near the Baron Hotel. The Pentagon, and Francine, is also confirming multiple U.S. civilian casualties at Kabul airport. That first bomb went off outside of the airport. The second blast is near the Baron Hotel, Francine.
Yeah, so what we know, and there are a number of reports, Alex, and we're trying to really, go through all of them to see what's confirmed, what's not confirmed. We're at the moment of speculation, but the U.S. has said that there are a number of casualties. They reiterated that actually the exact number for the moment is unknown. The U.K. has come on the record to say that there are no records of British casualties so far. As you're saying, the incident we know has just taken place outside the Abbey Gate, one of the checkpoints actually to then get into Kabul airport, where American and also British troop forces have been stationed. We were looking at live pictures of the airport from afar. We'll get you those as soon as we have them back.
Yep, and in terms of the market, we are seeing some kind of risk-off feel in some of the asset classes. I'm not saying there's a direct correlation. I just want to give you the facts. You're seeing the Russell 2000, the NASDAQ, the Dow, the S&P all roll over there. You're seeing a bid into the dollar. You're not seeing yet a bid into the bond market. You're still seeing a little rise within the bond market. Yields up by 1 basis point on the 10-year. But nonetheless, in terms of the equity market, maybe the FX market, it does feel like we're moving more into a risk-off field, Francine.
Yeah, it does, and you're right. I mean, we can't correlate it, but it's very clear that actually if you have an explosion like that, the markets are going to take pause to try and figure out what that means for evacuations, if there are any more bigger geopolitical things at play. So we're seeing a little bit of a risk-off mood in the European stocks. Again, we also are getting Federal Reserve members talking at Jackson Hole tomorrow. All eyes on what we hear from Jay Powell. We had 2 non-voting members, but they were quite hawkish on what the Fed should actually do, and that's when we started to see a bit of reversal on the Europe Stoxx 600. The Italian 10-year yield, it's been one of the biggest stories actually over the summer, and we've seen quite a lot of movement in the last couple of days, Alex.
Yeah, indeed. All right, let's get the latest then on those developments in Afghanistan. Bloomberg's Joe Matthew joins us now from Washington, D.C. Joe, take us through everything that we know so far.
Pretty remarkable to see this confirmation from the spokesman at the Pentagon, John Kirby, as you were just reading on the air, Alex. We've got a series of explosions here, a coordinated attack. We're really trying to be careful, though, with what we know and what we do not know. As the sun sets in Kabul, there are a lot of reports of casualties. There are a lot of reports of coordination here around the airport. But this is the very argument that this White House has been making for leaving. Over the past couple of days, the Pentagon briefings, the White House briefings, words that we've heard from the White House National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, have referred to potential terrorist attacks from ISIS-K. We've heard this on a daily basis when they make the case for leaving and not staying beyond August 31st. In terms of what's happening at the White House right now, we've seen a series of delayed briefings. The schedule has been thrown out the window here, and we do know, as we wait for a Pentagon briefing and a White House briefing around noontime today, we do know that President Biden has been briefed on this. Not only that, he was in the Situation Room when the blast, that first blast, occurred. That's a pretty remarkable coincidence, or at least a case of good timing for the president, because all of the tools there that go all the way down the chain of command are at his hands. And it is possible, because we do have satellites, we have birds, as they call them, over Kabul in this very critical time. It's possible he was seeing real-time images of what was happening on the ground. So we're going to see the circles wagging here for a bit at the White House. They've gone quiet for a moment, but then we'll have briefings from the Pentagon and from the White House in the next couple of hours.
Joe, Western intelligence agencies had warned of an imminent threat. What does it mean for evacuations?
Well, that's a great question. We have at least 1,500 Americans, as we learned yesterday, still in the country. We have 5,000 to 6,000 troops all in one area, and that's why this was a target, of course. We're not at Bagram anymore. We're only at HKIA, at that airport in Kabul, and of course the Taliban controls the area for the most part outside of that airport. It's unclear what's going to happen to flights overnight here. It's unclear what happens to all of those people who were in line at the gates. These were already dangerous areas, and the idea of suicide bombers walking into that zone creates ever more chaos, not just for our troops, but of course for the civilians who are trying to get out.
Yeah, and I wonder, Joe, what appropriate response is going to be here? I mean, how do you retaliate in this kind of situation? How do you then secure the evacuation of those that still haven't yet been evacuated? And how do you deal with that August 31st timeline? Can you take us inside best information you may have about the conversations like that are unfolding at the White House right now?
All great questions. The White House has a lot of questions to answer today, but we know that the Pentagon has been looking at a series of possible scenarios that have included a terror attack, that have also included going outside of the airport gates to find Americans and chopper them into that zone. We have seen a series of rescues already that have taken place in the last week where Americans were not able to get to the gates. This could become a much more determined effort to find people and get them to that airport once it's deemed safe to get them out of the country. Remember, we're not only evacuating civilians, the troops themselves must soon leave. Earlier today, John Kirby, again the spokesman for the Pentagon, refuted a report that said everyone has to be out. We have 36 hours to get this done. But in the next couple of days, before the 31st arrives, we have to start getting military hardware and military people out of Kabul. That timeline could be accelerating as we speak. But then again, let's remember what President Biden said. We will leave on the 31st of August if the Taliban cooperates. Now, obviously, this is an ISIS attack. We don't know what kind of Taliban involvement there was, if any. There may have been none. But this type of activity could force the United States to push the timeline beyond August 31st and potentially use more military hardware, more military strategy to secure the airport.
Joe, as you rightly say, if these are Islamic State insurgents that actually are not friendly with the Taliban in Afghanistan or do not have friendly relationships with the Taliban in Afghanistan, how much does this further complicate an already very complicated situation on the ground?
Well, it's some thought that this was a possibility. Some thought it was inevitable, that there might be a suicide bomber, that there could be kidnappings, that there could be a hostage situation, and we still have several more days for this to unfold. But you're right. We've heard repeatedly from White House officials and from the national security apparatus here in Washington that ISIS is the enemy of the Taliban. They're not working together here. But there are also several factions of the Taliban out there. It's not just the de facto head of the Taliban in Kabul trying to paint this image of a 2.0 of a new Taliban. There are other factions of the Taliban throughout Afghanistan, and it's unclear where they stand on all of this. The fact of the matter is the U.S. is on its own here, the U.S. and its allies. And as we've heard from the president repeatedly, we have no reason to trust the Taliban at this point in time.
Joe, thank you very much for disseminating all the information for us. Joe Matthew of Bloomberg. Just to recap some of those headlines, the Pentagon now confirming that there has been a second blast in Kabul near the Baron Hotel. They're also confirming that there are multiple U.S. and civilian casualties at the bombing that happened outside of the airport. We're going to bring you more details as they cross. Currently, we're still waiting for the Pentagon briefing that was pushed back from 10:30, and you're looking at a definite risk-off now feel in the market. The S&P now down by 0.5 percentage point. This is Bloomberg. Live from New York, I'm Alex Steele alongside Francine Lacroix in London. This is Bloomberg Markets. Want to get you updated on that news. The Pentagon now confirming that there's been a second blast near the Baron Hotel in Kabul, in addition to the blast outside the Kabul airport. And there are multiple U.S. and civilian casualties from that bombing outside the Kabul airport. The market reaction is risk off. You are seeing a bid into the dollar. Yields are going nowhere. You are seeing equities right around the lows of the session. Want to bring in Bloomberg's Vincent Signorella. He's the voice of Bloomberg Audio Squawk. He's talking to traders all day. Vincent, how is the market? How are traders paying attention to these headlines today?
Well, the traders, I've got to be perfectly honest with you, a lot of them are really confused because they just haven't been around long enough to experience some of the geopolitical risk of this nature. A lot of people, and I see it in the press all the time, comparing this to Saigon. This is really nothing like Saigon in my experience. This is very much more akin to what happened in '79 with the Iran hostage crisis. There are a lot of Americans in jeopardy in Iran, and there's really a failing or falling confidence that we're going to be able to get them and the Afghan citizens who helped us, as well as the other foreign citizens. There are 20 buses, Macron has just confirmed, waiting near the airport in Kabul, trying to get French citizens out, and he's saying now that he doesn't know that they can be evacuated. So this is a major risk-off situation, depending on how this plays forward.
Right.
I think it brings into light next Wednesday's OPEC meeting, because there's a potential that OPEC could take advantage of this, as they did way back when, and put a good bid into energy prices as well.
So, Vincent, there's a danger that OPEC flood the market or take advantage of the chaos in foreign policy currently to flood the market with barrels of oil?
Well, no, actually not. I think quite the other way around. It depends on how the Middle East sees this situation. If they want to support the United States, they will do exactly what you said, put more oil into the market, and that would be pressure on the energy prices. If they want to take advantage of the geopolitical situation and see demand falling, they may pull back on oil to try to shore up oil prices. It's just going to be interesting, I think, to see what they say. It's not a predictable event, but I just think it makes that that meeting a little bit more important than perhaps it was before today.
Hey, Vince, the dollar, is it playing the safe haven role today?
A little bit. It's pulled back a little bit. It's had a really big run up the last week or so. So we've seen some profit taking earlier in the week. It's bounced. It's up again, but it's definitely off the highs. It's just up about 0.2%. But if this situation develops, and it's really hard to see that this is a one and done situation when it comes to ISIS. The more of this we see, the more of this hostility that could develop, the more risk off we're going to see, and then we'll definitely see a bid like we're seeing right now in gold, which was down on the morning, which is now up about 0.3%. So I think you could easily see a bid for gold and also a bid for the dollar.
Vincent, thank you so much. Vincent Signorella there from Bloomberg. Now let's continue, of course, this trader seeking haven narrative with Alberto Gallo, Algebris head of macro strategies and portfolio manager for the Algebris Global Credit Opportunities Fund. Alberto, thank you for joining us. I want to talk about BTPs and some of the bonds in a second, but overall, over the last 5 to 6 years, and we have had terrorist attacks. It doesn't get any easier every time you have to bring that kind of news. But in the past, markets have largely discounted these kind of big geopolitical shift and terrorism. Will this time be different?
I don't think this time is different. However, there is a signaling effect on future foreign policy. Many U.S. allies are asking themselves whether the United States will be there for them when the time comes. And one example is Ukraine. Another example is Lithuania, for example, and countries that are near Belarus, which is a proxy state for Russia. And we know that Taiwan is another case in point. So nothing will change short term, but probably a lot of these countries will want to hedge themselves economically, strengthening their ties with China or with other allies if they can. And another big question is about Europe. Europe has counted on NATO. But NATO has lost relevance over the past years, especially under the Trump administration. So Europe will need to invest more to develop its own defense force. These are all long-term developments. For investors, the long-term development, the long-term question is what will happen to the dollar. In moments of risk off, the dollar is bought. But over time, as China and Russia gain more relevance and China's yuan gains more relevance, there's going to be a multipolar currency system. That's the most important question for the next decade.
So how do you invest in that sort of thesis?
Short term, we think that these actions, and on top of that, the Chinese crackdown on the private sector are going to endanger emerging markets. We think that there's more business and more capital going back to the US There's onshoring of supply chains. Companies like Intel will want to make semiconductors in the US, not only in Taiwan. And so there is a positive impact on the dollar and on US and European stock markets. But in the medium term, you're seeing different countries promoting their economic model, and what China is doing against inequality, what China is doing for sustainability might also work. So in the long term, we're going to see a multipolar model, and we're going to see more volatility as the Fed and the ECB start tightening, and Western economies run a bit out of stimulus in the next year.
We'll talk about volatility. Now, Italian bonds in particular, Alberto, have been bolstered over the summer months. I think we have a chart that we'll show in just a second. This comes, of course, as there a wind down in supply, and at the same time, the continuation of the ECB bond buying. Does that all change come autumn?
Market fragility. So one of the things you just said is, stocks are down and bonds are down as well. So obviously, Italy's bonds are not a safe haven, but even treasuries and bonds are down or selling off today. So the correlation of risky assets with risk-free assets has turned to positive. And some of the things where investors were long for carry or simply, holding their cash are now selling off when markets are selling off. In other words, there's no place to hide. And that's exactly what's happened in 2018 and 2013, when central banks started to taper. There's potentials for tantrums. Markets have become more fragile because there's only one traffic light driving the flow of capital. It's either green when there's QE and it's red when QE stops. This is a very important development with a lot of implications. One of them is, is the 40-60 bond stock portfolio still good enough? Probably it's not good enough, because you have both assets selling off when you need to have a safe haven. And so we invest in a very different way from what you would have done 10 or 15 years ago before QE.
So where do you think a taper tantrum will be felt? I feel like a few weeks ago we saw it in equities, then we saw it in the dollar when the dollar had that really big run. Some say maybe the last couple days we saw it in the bond market, particularly as Europe led that, as you had Philip Lane sort of hinting that, yeah, okay, maybe at some point tapering's on the table. Where do you feel it the most, and how do you take advantage of that?
There's already some fires coming up in emerging markets. If you look at the countries that are more sensitive to China, and also where central banks haven't really reacted to higher inflation. So Brazil local markets have gone above 10% yield on the 10-year in local currency. Peru is another country with a lot of political risk. So you've got to look at the first fires that are starting are in the vulnerable emerging markets, South Africa as well. And that's in local markets, in local currencies, but gradually could spill over also to emerging markets that are weak on their hard currency debt. We have very tight spread levels over treasuries on emerging market debt. I would say that the US high yield market is also almost priced for perfection. We have 3.3% spread on high yield bonds over treasuries, and that's almost the lowest ever, with a market that has where companies have levered up thanks to low yields. So you've got more levered firms and very low yields. Europe is a safe haven, yeah, but eventually it will be hurt as well.
What are you expecting from Jay Powell tomorrow? Could we? I mean, I know we've had two non-voting hawkish members talk more hawkish talk because they think the Fed should start tapering ASAP. But what do you think we'll hear from Jay Powell?
So we think that there's going to be hints about an announcement. The announcement should probably come in November. We think September is too early. Really, it's important to know when tapering starts, but it's very important to understand when tapering ends, because that's when the Fed will start looking at rate hikes. But in November announcement means that you might look at the first rate hike towards the end of next year, and that's a reasonable hawkish stance. It will not cause a collapse in markets, but there are probably some areas where markets are a bit too euphoric, a bit too complacent, like EM, like the lowest part of high yield, and these things might grind lower in price over the coming months.
Alberto, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time in rolling with this today. Alberto Gallo of Algebris joining us there to recap some of the recent headlines from Afghanistan. The Pentagon now confirms it's been an explosion outside the Kabul airport where there's been U.S. and civilian casualties. Also confirming a second Kabul blast near the Baron Hotel. We'll continue to update you as those headlines cross. This is Bloomberg.
We heard from the French President Emmanuel Macron just a couple of minutes ago, given a briefing in Ireland, saying that the situation in Afghanistan has profoundly deteriorated. He also said that the suspected suicide bomb, or a suspected suicide bomber, actually exploded outside the airport. What he also said, which is significant, is that France's ambassador in Afghanistan would now no longer remain in the country for security reasons. Now, the latest is that U.S. has confirmed 2 blasts at an entry at Kabul airport hours after intelligence agencies warned of imminent terrorist threats. And of course, the second one is close to one of the hotels. Let's get the latest on the markets with our Kriti Gupta, who joins us. Kriti, that and the fact that we could see a more hawkish Fed definitely gave a tilt lower to the markets.
Absolutely, Fran. A risk-off day to begin with, simply because of the anticipation ahead of Jackson Hole. These Afghan headlines have really just kind of kept that rolling even more. Just take a look at this board. You do, of course, see European stocks down broadly, but I really want to point to the fact that if we looked at what happened last week, you did, of course, have quite a lot of lack of market sensitivity to these Afghan headlines. A lot of people saying this has more political consequences than market consequences. That has been completely turned around in today's trade in particular. Now, if we were to flip up the boards, I would show you that the S&P 500 is continuing to take a hit. Even that NASDAQ outperformance is continuing to take a hit as well. And you do have some spot gains going into gold and into those haven currencies as well. The Australian dollar weakening against the Japanese yen, for example. So you do see a lot of pain right now in those risk currencies, especially in commodities and in those risk assets. This is the example I'm showing you. A lot of money going into yens in particular. Like I said, this is going to be crucial when we're talking about that global risk gauge, and it looks like stocks, bonds, commodities, you name it, they're all taking their cue from this risk-off sentiment.
Kriti, does it stay like that? Because as you mentioned, and rightly so, for the large part, the markets have ignored these geopolitical events. And I'm wondering if part of this is also thinning liquidity as we're in the last second week of August.
Right, and that's a big question right now, because if you actually look at the intraday move, it was about 0.3% in stocks, for example. That's not a huge move if you think about it on an average day until you put it into perspective. We've been talking about stocks hitting record gains, but let's talk about the margin that they're hitting those record gains with. It's 0.2%, 0.3%. So right now, traders, even with this kind of thin volume, are betting essentially their entire summer trading day gains on these Afghan headlines, something that could potentially turn around, like I said, in anticipation of Jackson Hole tomorrow.
All right, Kriti, thanks very much. Members, Kriti Gupta joining us there. European equities, though, not left out either. They're also lower on the day, except for the FTSE 100 is eking out a gain up 0.3%. Volume really light. European close is up next. This is Bloomberg.
Well, stocks finishing up the trading day here in Europe, but definitely a risk-off kind of mood. We did see a bit of pressure on some of the economically sensitive stocks ahead of Jackson Hole. We had 2 non-voters from the FOMC also talk about the hawkishness that they see coming, because no matter what kind of data points they want to look at in the next couple of weeks, they say that the Fed should actually start tapering now, not to miss the boat. Now, that, of course, also coupled with the explosions that we see in Kabul, in the past largely discounted, have some of these terrorist threats, some of these explosions across the world. Today feels a little bit different because, of course, it has a lot of implications for security in the region. This would be an Islamic group that would be against the Taliban. It also has huge implications for evacuation. So you can see actually the Stocks Europe 600 finishing the day on a low about 0.3% lower. Now let's also look at some of the individual indices. If we go country by country, similar actually losses across the board, with the FTSE down some 0.3%. Maybe it is really the UK who has been part of the evacuation of Kabul that has seen a little bit more of the brunt. Also, a couple of inflation data from the BOE. I don't know whether that's moving some of the FTSE 100 stocks, but certainly it has been moving gilts here in the UK. All right, these are the groups that we're watching. It was media actually holding up the most with construction. I think earlier on we also saw healthcare and energy, but actually finishing now the day on a low with basic resources, travel and leisure, and utility. Again, these are the kind of more economic prone stocks that are finishing lower ahead of Jackson Hole. Now, I mentioned media, and this is one of the stocks that we're watching, Vivendi. You can see actually gaining some 2.6%. This is after we had a number of reports from other media stocks saying that they will be better than expected in terms of their groups. Delivery Hero, this is a little bit like Just Eat or Deliveroo, coming out with targets that disappointed the markets, down 2.6%. This is the really big one. This is the asset management arm of Deutsche Bank, down some 13.7%. This is after we heard from U.S. authorities that they will actually look at an investigation because they misreported some of the ESG targets. Alex, this is a huge deal because I don't know whether it's only DWS or whether this raises the alarm for financial stocks in general on the way they report some of their ESG metrics.
Yeah, it's such a good point, Francine, because, Deutsche Bank's asset management is not the only asset manager in the world that's trying to invest more within these ESG sustainable guidelines, which also just highlights the fact that there needs to be a uniform guideline set from, at least here in the U.S., from the SEC to say, this is your criteria, now you can go meet it. The problem is there isn't any, and it's hard to know how much of that is greenwashing and how much of that is just pure confusion at the end of the day.
Yeah, 100%. But it's something that really took a lot of investors by surprise because 3 weeks ago, it was a former ESG chief at DWS that set the alarm. And then, 3 weeks afterwards, there's a huge investigation. So you can see this could escalate quite quickly.
Yep, and also I have to wonder too, what this means for bonuses, right? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't a lot of banks now tying bonuses and salaries to their ESG targets and sustainability, et cetera? And I wonder, is that going to have an impact now as well? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know that either because I think they're just starting to link them. I don't know whether it's backward looking as well, but that's an excellent point. If, we could see actually the whole ESG financing, and there's been some great reporting from Jess Schenkelman and also Ashok Shah looking at the way that finance is working and actually whether there is stuff, whether, they did so honestly or whether there was a little bit of obscure, like smoke and mirrors to try and figure out exactly what was going on with these ESG targets.
Yeah, exactly. Need that uniform. Okay, really interesting story developing there. Also want to update you on the developing story over in Afghanistan. The Pentagon confirming that there's been 2 blasts, one outside the Kabul airport where there has been U.S. civilians as part of the casualties there, as well as a second blast outside of a hotel, the Baron Hotel, or near the Baron Hotel in Kabul as well. The Pentagon briefing was pushed back. Now it's been about an hour. We're going to bring you that briefing when it happens, and we'll keep you updated on any headlines as well. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets, the European close. I'm Ritika Gupta, and you're looking at a live shot of the principal room. Coming up, Mary Barra, the chairman and CEO of General Motors. That's at 12 p.m. in New York, 5 p.m. in London. This is Bloomberg. Let's check in on the Bloomberg First Word News. I'm Ritika Gupta. Vice President Kamala Harris says she raised human rights concerns with Vietnamese officials after being criticized by activist groups. In Hanoi, Harris said she brought up the issue of dissidents serving prison terms. But when she was questioned, Harris didn't explain how Vietnam's human rights record is different from that of China, another communist country that doesn't tolerate dissent. Japan has halted use of 1.6 million doses of Moderna's coronavirus vaccine. Several vaccination sites reported foreign particles were found in the vials of the vaccine. There have been no safety concerns tied to the vials so far. Moderna says manufacturing issues arose at a contract site in Spain. And the British market regulator says it's not capable of supervising Binance's operations in the UK that led the Financial Conduct Authority to crack down on the cryptocurrency trading firm. The FCA says Binance failed to provide sufficient information about its business. The firm says it's engaging with the agency to resolve outstanding issues. And bosses in Manhattan have lowered their expectations for a return to office next month. Cases of the Delta variant are on the rise in New York, and a survey by Partnership for New York City says employers now see 41% of office workers returning by September the 30th. That's down from an estimate of 62% in May. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Alex.
All right, thanks so much, Ritika. So let's get to the breaking news from Afghanistan. Pentagon, again, confirming that there have been two bomb attacks within Kabul, one outside the airport where there are multiple U.S. civilian casualties, and a second one near the Baron Hotel. Now, the Taliban is now reporting the casualties from the airport blast could rise. Taliban is saying that 13 people have so far died. We have not been able to confirm that, and is not confirmed by the Pentagon. Want to get more headlines here from Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern. Anne-Marie, the Pentagon briefing was supposed to take place at 10:30. Do we know when that's going to happen? What are the conversations right now?
Yeah, we just don't know when that Pentagon briefing is going to happen. Obviously, the Pentagon is likely trying to just take stock of the situation on the ground before they start briefing the press and the world. At the White House, also, the President of the United States, he was in the Situation Room when this first explosion happened by the Abbey Gate, and he probably remains there. We're unclear where his whereabouts is right now, but likely in the Situation Room with his national security team. But following on that, he was supposed to be sitting down with the Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett. There are a lot of Israeli journalists here today for this event, and that has been delayed. So the key focus of the White House, the State Department, the Pentagon today is clearly going to be on this airport. Who was responsible for this? How many casualties are out of it? And what does it mean for the evacuation to get this mission done by August 31st? But at the moment now, everyone is behind closed doors. We're just waiting to hear them brief the press.
Anne-Marie, we're also hearing from the Taliban now blaming Americans for the crowds and the chaos ahead of these blasts. How much anxiousness would there be right now in the Situation Room, in the Pentagon, in the White House? Because this seems to be a sophisticated attack, because there are two explosions that went on almost simultaneously.
Yeah, one was by Abbey Gate and the other was the Baron Hotel, which is about 2 miles from the airport. So according to an Afghan that was near there that spoke to Bloomberg, he had said that this was a large group of people waiting to get through to try to get into the compound of the airport via the U.S. military to get on those evacuation flights, and that's where it took place. It's a very difficult situation, I imagine, for officials right now. But officials have been warning of this. President Biden said on Tuesday that he was worried about acute threats from the likes of ISIS-K, Khorasan, that is the offshoot of ISIS that we've seen in Iraq and Syria. And just yesterday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken reiterated the same. He said it's a very difficult situation. It is very difficult in terms of the security protocols because of what they fear would be an attack by the ISIS-K in Kabul. But of course, we have to remember these are a lot of reports coming in. We need to really wait till we get that Pentagon briefing to really understand what happened on the ground.
All right, thank you so much, our Anne-Marie Hordern there with the very latest. We also understand from the Ministry of Defense here in the UK that there have been no reported UK military or government casualties in Kabul. We understand that the US President is currently in the Situation Room with the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staffs. Now, we'll have plenty more, of course, on Kabul. We'll have plenty more on the impact on the markets. So let's get also straight to Bill Raggio, Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's Senior Fellow. He's a terrorism analyst and an editor at Long War Journal. Bill, thank you so much for joining us. Your immediate thoughts on these attacks. How sophisticated were they? And does it mean that evacuations by U.S. troops need to be sped up or actually slowed down until everything is more under control?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It is a sophisticated attack. Anytime you plan two suicide bombings at two different locations and time them for the maximum impact, both politically and for the press and militarily, you know that some type of coordination is going on. Look, the Biden's policy here of trusting the Taliban to secure Kabul is a major problem, and this was inevitable. This was destined to happen. the U.S. military is going to want to pause things in a moment. I've seen photographs of U.S. soldiers and Marines in the crowds outside the gates, standing right next to Taliban fighters. They're starting to expose themselves. Three Marines, I heard, were wounded in this event, and 13 killed, is according to Reuters. And so, yeah, they're going to have to slow things down, at least figure out how to manage security. But they're really going to have to reconsider trusting the Taliban to do this. Right.
So, Bill, how does that relationship then evolve now? Because what we're understanding is that potentially this was a spinoff in some areas of ISIS that is not a Taliban supporter. The Taliban does not then support them, in which case you think the Taliban would want to help the U.S. secure the location in the airport, but that would pit the two enemies together. How does that work?
The Taliban Islamic State relationship is complicated. They're enemies, but there is indications that at times they cooperate. This is in the United Nations report. It's very complicated and it's very difficult to distill in such a quick conversation. But look, I don't think the Islamic State does something like this without certain elements of the Taliban being aware of this. This is why trusting the Taliban to provide security, and the Taliban hasn't been making things easy for the evacuees. They've been making it difficult. They're the reasons for these crowds, these checkpoints, and all of that. So this is, again, I just keep going back to, if you trust terrorists to protect you from other terrorists, you're making a major mistake.
So, Bill, do you think this could be used as an excuse for the Taliban? I mean, the Taliban don't want Afghans to actually leave the country. That has been, made plain and clear. So can they be even harder on the U.S. to try and, prevent them from getting people out?
Yes, it certainly will. It will make things more difficult. Basically, the U.S. has been asking citizens and others the special visas to come outside, to come to the airport. They're not going out to get them. And, when you see suicide bombings like this, it makes, I helped a family of 5 with 3 small children. They had to go to the airport 3 separate times to get out of the country. If you watch what just happened there, it's going to be very difficult for people to come to you. The president is going to have to make the decision to go out and get people if he wants to get them out by August 31st.
So what does that look like, Bill? I mean, that feels like more troops. Is that more staff on the ground? Like, what does that look like in actuality?
This is all about risk, right? There's the risk of, if you send troops out, that it comes into clashes with the Taliban. But then the risk is that your citizens could be killed outside the gates in a suicide bombing. We have assets to do this. Our allies are doing this. The French, the British, the Germans have been sending teams out to go get their people. The U.S. has been reluctant to do this because I believe the U.S. is basically does not want to give the appearance of provoking the Taliban.
Bill, what does this mean for Islamic State insurgents? If they're behind the attack, how ugly could it be for foreign policy and terrorism across the world?
Yeah, if the Islamic State is responsible for the attack, and it's likely, there's a possibility that this attack doesn't go claimed. We've seen major attacks like this in Kabul over the years go unclaimed, which raises suspicions. But if the Islamic State was able to do this, the reality is the Islamic State is a minor player in Afghanistan. It's the Taliban and its allies, Al-Qaeda and others, that are the primary threat. The Islamic State is really a tertiary threat. But they do have the capability to do this, and this will inspire fighters throughout the world.
Bill, I'm asking you to speculate a little bit, but based on your intimate knowledge of what's going on the ground and your years of experience, who was the target of the 2 bombs that we saw? And in that case, where else can we be worried?
I think the target of this attack is just generally to disrupt. If it's the Islamic State, they want to just kill as many Americans and foreigners as possible. If it's another group, if it's the Taliban or some type of ally to the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, I think the purpose of that attack is to continue. I think this entire effort, what we've seen, the chaos in Kabul is orchestrated by the Taliban to maximize the chaos and to maximize the humiliation for the U.S. and Western allies. And if it was conducted by elements within the Taliban, then this would just be part of that, to make things more difficult to conduct the evacuation, to increase the chaos.
Bill, we really appreciate your perspective today. Bill Roggio of the Foundation of the Defense of Democracies, thank you. And just to sort of go through some of the details, we know there's been 2 explosions, as confirmed by the Pentagon, one outside Kabul airport where there have been U.S. civilian casualties, the other near a hotel in Kabul. Now, the Taliban spokesman commented by phone. Here are some of the headlines from them. The Taliban is blaming the U.S., saying that they're responsible for security at the site blast. They're saying it's the Americans' fault because of the crowds and because of the chaos ahead of the blast. They say that 13 Afghans are dead in the explosion near the airport and that number could rise. And they say that the Taliban's probing who conducted the airport attack. This is Bloomberg. To the markets, Kansas City Fed President Esther George sticking with her call for a start to taper this year despite the Delta variant risk. She spoke to Bloomberg's Michael McKee ahead of the Jackson Hole Symposium.
Watching the level of inflation right now certainly has gotten my attention. It's gotten the attention of many households and businesses in my region that frankly hadn't had to think about inflation for many years in their decision making. So it's not something to ignore by any means. Having said that, I do think that it is reasonable to assume that what we're seeing right now is coming from the combination of robust demand running up against supply constraints. And that, of course, is keeping upward pressure on prices. Over time, I would expect that to moderate. And that, I think, is a reasonable assumption to make. But that, of course, will depend on a variety of other factors. To what extent does risk from the virus affect those supply chains? Will they become more persistent? Will it begin to build into people's expectations in a way that will cause us to have to rethink that policy accommodation different than we are today?
You've always been on the lookout for inflation and one of the first to warn about the possibilities. So I'm wondering if you think we would have time, or you would have time, since I don't have a vote, you would have time to react if inflation proved not to be transitory and that you're not behind the curve.
So it's hard to say today, given where we are in this recovery. Certainly, the committee has the tools it needs to respond to inflation. That, of course, is always a function of understanding what's going on in the broader economy. And it's hard to judge, but I think no one should question that the committee is committed, that I'm committed to a 2% inflation objective over the long run for the economy. And we'll just have to see how this transition in the economy from a terrible pandemic shock to beginning to recover from that unfolds.
I have to ask you one last question on a fiscal side. Leaving aside the merits and the partisan issues involved in the budget that was just passed by Congress, do you worry that billions more, hundreds of billions more in spending would be inflationary?
So I think the question of fiscal spending is one that I'm going to defer to fiscal policymakers to judge. I think as a monetary policy maker, I will be watching carefully any number of impacts to our economy, including fiscal spending, to understand how it might change the dynamics for how we achieve the objectives that Congress has given us.
That was the Kansas City Fed President Esther George speaking to Bloomberg's Michael McKee. Michael, it was a great interview, and it's very clear that the hawks are now circling before that Jay Powell speech. Does she actually believe that some of the bond purchases are ineffective or could actually be harmful?
Yeah, because at this point there's more than necessary, and of course she's been an inflation hawk, and if we are driving up inflation by putting more money out there, particularly in assets, that's an issue. So she'd like to get started, but she is more sanguine about the length of time we're going to see elevated inflation than one might anticipate for Esther George. She did suggest that at this point, they're close enough. You can see there, the Fed's white line is the PCE inflation rate that the Fed follows. It's above well above, double their 2% target. But unemployment not low enough yet, so they want to keep pressing down on that. But they don't need the tapering. They don't need the QE to do it.
So did you get a sense as to how the conversation is in terms of how fast they could eventually taper?
Not from her, because she sort of avoided the question.
Oh, fair enough.
Jim Bullard has been outspoken in saying he'd like to have it done by the second quarter of 2022. Rob Kaplan, we're going to speak with Rob Kaplan tomorrow, and Jim Bullard, has said that we should do it in about 8 months. It took 2 years last time, so perhaps they can get started by the end of the year.
All right, Mike, thanks a lot. Looking forward to all your coverage tomorrow. Bloomberg's Michael McKean. You can follow that coverage tomorrow. You got San Francisco Fed's annual economic symposium. Michael McKean will bring you all those key moments right here on Bloomberg Television. In the meantime, let's recap those headlines for you out of Afghanistan. The Pentagon confirming there have been 2 blasts, one outside of a hotel near the Baron Hotel in Kabul, as well as outside of the airport, where there's been U.S. civilian casualties. The Taliban spokesman speaking about this, blaming the U.S., saying they're responsible for the security at the site, and due to the crowds there that evening, that in essence caused the type of intense blast that we saw. Also saying, though, that they are going to probe who conducted the airport attack and that they will condemn them in, quote, the strongest terms. All right, coming up, Balance of Power. Mary Barra, Chair and CEO of General Motors, will be joining David Weston. This is Bloomberg.